Good morning and a very warm welcome on this very cold day to the Sustainable Business Network and our session on sustainable procurement. So let's have a look at the agenda. We do have a full programme and we're going to start as normal with the legal and market update brought to us by Zoe Booth from Carbon Footprint. And then we are going to be moving on to look at sustainable procurement over at Marwell Wildlife. And that's brought to us by Dr. Duncan East. Delighted to have him here today. He does need to shoot off at 10:30. So if there are questions, specific points you need to ask Duncan, please ask them at the end of his presentation there. Our final speaker, delighted to have Maya McKnight from Basingstoke and Deane Borough Council, who'll explain some principles of sustainable procurement and some of those as applied by the council there. There is a Q&A session, so as I've mentioned, we will take a few questions after each of the individual presenters, and then there'll be a panel discussion right at the end. That's what today looks like. And just to get things kicked off and to warm people up a little bit this morning, what we do have is a little poll for you. So many times we'll tell you to put your phones away, but actually I want you to get your phone out now. The QR code there is asking how your business is currently doing with its sustainable procurement. What actually are you doing? Maybe you're doing something, maybe you're not doing anything. My colleague Zoe is just going to pop into the chat function the manual link to that. So those of you whose phones don't do QR codes, please follow that. I think Zoe's about to pop that into the chat function there, and we'll just give you a minute to look at that. So the first question on there is asking, are you actually doing sustainable procurement that you'd recognise right now? And then there's a couple of extra questions just asking the type of benefits that you're hoping to get and you value from sustainable procurement. What I should say at this point is your name and your organisation won't be associated with this. It's done completely anonymously. And what we're just trying to do is gauge what the audience is doing at the moment. And after Zoe's update is on the legal things, we'll have a look at the results from that. So please click away at that and scan that into your phone, and we will now move on to Zoe, please, with the legal and market update. Over to you.
Thanks, Wendy. Hopefully you can all see that now. So this week, we've actually had some really exciting news in the aviation industry. We've had the first transatlantic flight, or Flight 100 as it's been termed, by Virgin Atlantic. That was powered by 100% sustainable aviation fuels, or SAFs, and that was actually from London Heathrow to JFK, which is a really brilliant achievement to see this week. We also have in the middle here the outcomes of the Global Investment Summit, which was largely kind of financial packages towards renewable projects. That includes heat pumps, waste to heat energy, and offshore winds as well. And last week we also had the statement release from Vera confirming submission of their application to have their VCS projects, or Verified Carbon Standard projects, assessed against the Core Carbon Principles, or CCPs, which were developed by the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, or ICVCM. I know that is a lot of acronyms, but the industry seems to love them at the moment. But that showcases their continued commitment to high standard carbon offsetting projects, which is also great to see. This week, we've also obviously had the opening of COP28, which started yesterday. I've just popped a few bits in here of some of the things that we've seen leading up to this. This includes some household names, IKEA, BT and Nestle, just down there on the left, who are urging the government to back the end of fossil fuels at the COP this week. We also have Global Logistics Company just on the right here, who will be hosting side talks during the event around sustainable value chains. Obviously, you guys here today have signed up for this with an interest in that, so you might want to keep an eye out for the outcomes of that. It's not actually part of COP, but New Look, which is obviously another high street name, has just announced that they're focusing efforts on their supply chain sustainability as well. Again, something that's quite topical for today's SBN, as you all know. Obviously, we don't have the outcomes of COP28 yet, as it's only just started. But in addition to progressing towards the current Paris goals, the key aims I've just listed out here are fast tracking clean energy to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, financing developing nations and working on new deals for those, a focus on nature and people, and also making COP28 the most inclusive so far. We have seen some concerns in the news or criticism around the location about the possibility of some companies striking up new oil and gas deals. We don't know if those are true, but they are in the media, of course, and something to think about perhaps. So we've seen there are a couple of new news pieces around sustainable supply chains. So I've just popped in some general pointers here. I'm not going to go into too much detail because, as Wendy mentioned, Maya from Basingstoke and Deane Borough Council will be going through some of this with you as well with a little bit more detail. So why they kind of matter. For a lot of you, this will matter kind of from a carbon emissions point. They tend to be the significant part of your scope 3 emissions. You may also find that some of your own customers or consumers are driving you to do a little bit more with your targets, for example, and therefore you're having to look at your supply chain, and also this is a systemic change that is required. We can't kind of do this individually. It needs to be kind of a team effort, as it were. Obviously, I've mentioned a bit there about emissions, but there are other sustainability benefits mentioned just there as well. And I've just listed out some general pointers. So typically speaking, measuring or screening, this might be emissions, but it might be other environmental areas as well, or sustainability areas, to identify the hotspots, and then working with those key suppliers. Collaboration really is the key here, as I've just popped down there. Just at the bottom here, I've popped in a resource for you for a sustainable procurement ISO, the 4000. So we've just got the links down there. There is a link to a free documentation for it as well, just on the slide. And that gives kind of an overview. It was released in 2017, but it was last reviewed this year, so it is up to date. It might just give you some ideas there as well. And we've also got the Supply Chain Sustainability Report, which is written by MIT in collaboration with the marketing councils. This provides a brief overview of some of the things that organisations are doing globally, so it might just give you some ideas there. We are still waiting on updates to best practice for net zero, which if you've been to an SPM before, you will have seen us touch upon previously. This will be the independent one that we're keeping an eye on, so the ISO 14068 on carbon neutrality. So that will be really good because it's, as I say, independent. It can be certified by any ISO auditor, not just an own brand organisation. It is in the review stages. It was due to be released in November, but obviously we are now in December, so possibly an early 2024 release there. In the interim, I've just popped down there the ISO net zero guidelines. If you are interested in those are free to access as well. And of course, we also do have PAS 2060 as a standard for net zero areas too. I know Maya will touch on some of these bits later on as well. Just an update on ESOS Phase 3. Some of you will know already that the deadline has been extended to the 5th of June. We did actually see the changes in legislation come into force on the 29th of November, so that is out now. I've popped a link down there for you to go and have a look if this is relevant to you. There are no changes to the qualification criteria or date, which we already knew was kind of going to be the case. I haven't had a chance to review this properly yet, but we have seen that the 5% de minimis change is in there, as we did expect to see from that. And as kind of typical, we've got our fines in here. We always do see water companies here. So we've got story here where Yorkshire Water have made the largest contribution ever voluntary to charities. Obviously, this is as a result of a water incident where they polluted a river. But it is nice to see some of that money going back into the local charities that can make the changes there. We've also got United Utilities, who have actually been fined £800,000 for illegally abstracting a large amount of water from boreholes. They didn't actually breach their limit for the month or the year, but they did inadvertently breach their limit as part of a 3-year rolling maximum and are kind of working to rectify that. We've also had an illegal waste tire operation where a man of 41 was charged £13,000. He worked for a small company in the northeast. His site did not have the appropriate permits, and he was found to be illegally depositing tyres at other sites as well as falsifying waste transfer notes there. And also we've had Norfolk Council working with private and government agencies, including Serco and DVLA, to reinforce to residents and businesses in the area that they are taking waste seriously, and they've actually managed to kind of catch and fine a series of fly tippers in the area, which has amounted to kind of thousands of pounds there. As usual, we've got our references list here for you, so you can get this in the slide pack afterwards and have a look at any of those stories in more detail. And of course, as always, you can contact me with the details just on the screen here if you do have any questions afterwards. I think that's everything, Wendy. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Zoe, for that whistle-stop tour through everything that's going on. And obviously, as we speak with COP28, there's so much happening. Even this morning, King Charles obviously has given his address to COP this morning. And gosh, yes, the Virgin Atlantic flight this week has been quite an exciting point. And, you know, that's a bit of a waymarker across to future green hydrogen flights as well. So lots of really exciting stuff happening today. Here's our first question. Well, what a split of results here, actually. I can see that a good number of you already have sustainable procurement formally set up in your business. So that's really good. But, you know, equally weighed and slightly higher as those that, don't or have an informal system in place. Okay, it's changing as we speak. So some real splits there. Some people there with, yes, some of our sustainable procurement extends to some other things, but maybe not all of our things. That's a really interesting split, I think, between all of those. Right, I can see that's going to keep going for a while. Maybe we'll just revisit that in a second, and we'll have a look at some of those more detailed questions as we go here. When we looked at how important is it to you in terms of reducing cost, waste and energy. Let's remember here, the higher numbers it's more important, so that's good. A good number of you think that's very important here. Great to see that no one thinks it's not important. Let's have a little look through at some of those other categories, which I think really may well echo what we're seeing in that last one. How important is it to enhance your brand and reputation? It is. Consumers will choose on that basis. So look at that rating, 4.6 on that. That's about the same level actually as on the cost there. Just moving across then. How important is it to improve quality and performance? Perhaps a little bit lower here, more splits here, which might reflect the different natures of your businesses. That's good to see. And moving on down, how important is it to foster innovation and competitiveness? Again, it's quite important, isn't it? You would hope that it would be. And for competitiveness. And let's also remember that it's good for us to encourage our competitors, peers in the market, because we all need to do this stuff. Here's the final one. Oh gosh, that is strong, isn't it? How important is it to mitigate your risks? Very. Look at that, 4.61. So that's probably the strongest of the benefits throughout all of those. Fascinating. Now we'll move on to our next speaker, and I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Duncan East from Marwell Wildlife. Over to you, Duncan, please.
Thanks very much, and thank you for having me. And Good morning to everybody out there. Very glad so many of you could make it. Interesting results there from the survey there, and it's good. Obviously, you must all think it's important or you wouldn't be here, but it's nice to see so many people taking their purchasing responsibilities so seriously. So that's really good. Just going to talk a bit this morning about what Marwell is doing about our supply chains and our purchasing decisions and what we value in our supply chain, which probably isn't going to come as a surprise to any of you. But I thought we'd sort of run through the detail of how we got to where we are now. First thing to think about, obviously COP28 going on at the moment. We're all concerned about carbon. We're thinking about our carbon reductions and climate change. But particularly with the supply chain, we need to not get focused on carbon to the exclusion of everything else. And Zoe touched on that, and the survey mentioned that as well, about avoiding risks from biodiversity collapse and environmental damage and social impact and exploitation of the workforce. There's so many other things we need to think about, and not just carbon. So obviously that scope 3 carbon is really important, but so is everything else. And balancing those different impacts is the thing that gives everyone a big headache in their sustainable purchasing. We all know what the impacts are from resource consumption, particularly. That's a palm oil plantation. Oh, I forgot where that one is. Malaysia, I believe. But obviously, a huge area of forest is being cleared for palm oil, for all sorts of uses, including biofuels. So there's definitely work to be done there to try and avoid this kind of damage and destruction of natural habitats. Equally, South America, similar sorts of destruction, but generally for things like soy production, agriculture. So lots of work to do on those areas. North America, lots of areas being clear-felled to produce pellets for biomass heating systems. Theoretically, that should be using waste wood, but actually, from a forester's point of view, if you just sort of decide, oh yes, all of these trees are a bit too wonky for planks, we'll just turn it all into pellets, it's a very easy and profitable system. So there's definitely a lot of controls and scrutiny that needs to go on to those sorts of supply chains. Open cast mining, obviously very clear scars. This one's a gold mine, but same is true of iron ore and all sorts of minerals. Lots of direct damage to the environment. Lithium mining in Bolivia, huge areas of land being taken up to obviously produce the lithium that we all need in all these battery vehicles and mobile phones and tablets and laptops and all the rest of it. And wherever you get mining, you inevitably get accidents. This one is in Brazil, where obviously you get sort of lax regulation and these sort of accidents happen. I think this was a copper mine, but equally there have been similar accidents in places like Canada from iron mining, where they've got much stricter regulations. But when you're working on such scale, accidents do happen and they cause an awful lot of damage, both to the environment and to the people who live in the area. And when you're working in poorer parts of the world, the rights and the land rights of local people are often overlooked, and you get this sort of disenfranchisement of indigenous peoples. And cultural rights as well. You may have seen this one in the news. It was about 5 years ago. The picture on the left is a site that was sacred to the First Nation people of Australia. I think those caves have been occupied for something like 40,000 years. And Rio Tinto, who are mining in the area just over the back of the hill, had an agreement with the local people that they weren't going to damage this environment. And then on the right, you can see that the area was significantly damaged. And whether that was an oversight, a lack of communication, or just corruption, it's very hard to tell. But they paid an enormous fine and they said they would restore it, but really the damage was done. So these supply chain impacts are huge and happening all the time. And destruction of soils is another one, from over-intensive farming and agriculture. And as soon as you degrade a soil, then suddenly it's no longer productive. And of course, when we talk about mining and people start talking about cobalt, then you get exploitation of workforces and children and slavery and all those sorts of abuses that we all need to worry about. And it's not just in other parts of the world. We had a big scandal in the UK with Boohoo and other clothing manufacturers, and people being underpaid and getting below minimum wage in some of the clothing factories in the UK. So there's a huge amount going on. And as a buyer and somebody, that's so many different things you need to consider about that it can seem completely overwhelming. As a small business, you've got to be thinking, well, I can't control whether people are employing children to mine the minerals that I need because I need a new computer for my office. So some of these things can be overwhelming, and you think, well, I've got no control at all. Whereas other areas you think, well, actually, maybe I can have a little bit of control. And so it's very easy to kind of just think, throw your hands up and say, I just can't do anything about this. And so what you need to do is think about, well, what can I do? Where are the areas I can influence? And you say, yeah, there really is. There's nothing I can do about cobalt mining to produce the battery for my laptop. And I've just got to rely on the people who are working in those areas to improve their supply chain. And that change is happening. There are now consortiums of battery manufacturers, both for electronic goods and car manufacturers, who are looking at their supply chains and trying to work on improving the impacts in those areas. And so there are areas that you can't do anything about at the moment, but you can keep an eye on those things so that as changes are made, you can make sure you're buying from the companies that are doing the right thing. And so you need to decide what your priorities are. And for every business, that'll be different. For Marwell, obviously, we're quite a broad business because we've got retail and catering, as well as the animals, and we've got a veterinary surgery. We're quite a broad business. Some businesses are much more focused on, a single sort of type of product line. So not everything will apply in equal weight to everybody. So you need to think about what is your priority and which is the thing that you need to be really worried about in your supply chain. If you don't use timber, then FSC certification may be a problem. Perhaps you don't sell fish. Probably quite a lot of people who don't sell fish. So MSC certification isn't necessarily relevant to you. So you need to pick your priorities and get that together into some sort of sustainable purchasing, or in our case, we call it ethical sourcing, some sort of policy that puts down your priorities, a little bit about your reasoning for why you've reached these conclusions, but get your priorities down in a document that you can then share internally and externally if you want to. This one's on our website if you want to go and read it, but particularly internally. So all the people who are doing your purchasing know what it is you're trying to achieve. And we found this a really useful document for engaging all the different departments at Marwell, because everybody's doing their own purchasing. This was a great talking point to get everyone started on that sort of sourcing journey. So now we're all of the same mindset, thinking we're a conservation charity, we can't be party to environmental destruction or the social destruction that then leads to more environmental destruction. So this was a talking point that meant all of our retail people, all of our catering people, our events people, our maintenance people, they're all talking about the same things now that we've got this policy that leads people in the same direction. And behind it then, some sort of procedure or process that sets out the details of how you go about making your purchasing decisions. I know we include things like a hierarchy of decision making. There's a questionnaire in there for sending out to new suppliers so they can answer questions about whether they've got environmental management systems, have they got a modern slavery statement, what do they do about energy and waste and water, and how do they pay their staff and how do they treat their staff, and do they work on their own biodiversity on their site. All of these stuffs are all in there in a big long questionnaire, so you can then compare different suppliers. And it is a big amount of work to try and do that. You've probably got many hundreds or thousands of suppliers, so you can't necessarily do all of them at once. But pick out your really biggest suppliers and start with the big ones that you think have the biggest impact. And a key thing is to think about what you're buying and apply some sort of hierarchy. So do you really need what you want, what this thing that you're about to buy? And that's really your first question. Maybe something broke down and you think, I've got to replace it. Well, do you need to replace it or could it be repaired? That's really your first question. Perhaps there's a new version which is shinier and whizzier than what you've already got, but actually the one you've got is doing the job and you don't really need the new one. Or maybe the one you've got is beyond repair. But how often do you actually need it? Could you just borrow one from another department or from one of your neighbouring businesses if you only use something occasionally? Further down the hierarchy, products as a service is becoming much more common nowadays. So maybe you don't need to buy one. Maybe you can hire it or lease it. Might be available secondhand, or there could be a refurbished version available. So really buying a new item is at the bottom of your hierarchy. It's the last thing you need to do when you need something is to think, right, buying a new one should be the final straw if I haven't managed to do any alternative one. If you're a manufacturer of a thing that you're trying to sell to people, then obviously this hierarchy could be a problem for you. And maybe you need to think about whether you shouldn't be selling that product. Maybe you should be providing it as a service on some sort of circular hire and return basis, so you can keep it refurbished and in the supply value chain for much longer. At Marwell, obviously we picked our priorities, and anything that obviously damages ecosystems and biodiversity was really important to us. So we we stopped using non-sustainable palm oil, so we weren't responsible for that sort of deforestation piece. And we chose fair trade items, so that the people growing commodities that we were using are being paid a fair wage, and therefore they're much less likely to destroy their local environment. We looked at various different products and packaging, what are the materials things are made out of. So things like organic cotton, working on this sort of compostable packaging so that at end of life, when you're throwing away the packaging bit, it is completely compostable. And this is the sort of packaging that you could put in your own home compost if you've got one, and it will break down completely. So you don't need to send it off to a commercial composting. And making things out of waste wood and that sort of stuff. So you've got really sustainable goods on sale, and that's very important to us in terms of our guests and our visitors, that they can see that we're doing the right thing, as well as being important to us that we are doing the right thing. And it goes back to all the usual things, it's paper, electrical goods. There are all different criteria for all the different things you buy. And in some cases, paper, so it's important that it's not coming from unsustainable timber. Electrical goods, they're not using excess energy. And things like fish, because we've got a restaurant, we have to think about the food that we serve to our guests. We obviously want it to be good quality because that's good for our reputation. We want to make sure it's come from sustainable sources, and that also extends to the fish that we serve to our penguins. And funnily enough, getting sustainable fish for penguins was much harder than it was getting it for the restaurants. Completely different supply chains and different levels of engagement. And so that was a much harder task, but we managed to find a source in the end. And the same goes for meat, whether that's, again, meat in the cafe or meat for our animals. We need to look at the animal welfare in those supply chains so that all of those animals are being as well treated as possible before we're then serving them to people or animals. And also, obviously, sending non-meat options and increasing the sort of plant-based options so we can start talking to people about sustainable diets. And other materials in all of our products we're starting to look at more and more. So all of our soft toys that we sell in the shop now are all made from recycled plastics. They're made from recycled plastic bottles. Still not ideal, because obviously a plastic bottle could be recycled into another plastic bottle. But collecting those up and turning them into these toys means that they're no longer made from virgin materials. So their Scope 3 carbon footprint of the soft toys is significantly lower. And we've switched to recyclable coffee cups now for takeaway coffee. Ideally, we'd like people to bring their own mugs, and we do a discount for people who bring their own mug. But if they want a takeaway coffee cup, they now get a recyclable one. And we have a recycling process in the zoo, so you can put your cup back into the right bin so it will get recycled. We have made some mistakes along the way. We have to hold our hands up and say some of the things we tried that we did in good faith at the time turned out not to be sustainable as we thought they would be. So for a while we were selling reusable coffee cups that were made from bamboo in our shop there for people to use in the catering outlets. But it turned out that these cups weren't as sustainable as we thought they were. They were supposed to be compostable at end of life, but it turned out that they were only compostable in a fairly industrial type compost process. And obviously more recently the stories are coming out about the melamine linings of them are not necessarily as safe as we thought they were, so we stopped selling those. And likewise, for a while we were doing what we thought again were compostable and biodegradable plastic cups for water and soft drinks in the cafe, but this is one that's been through my compost bin at home. Put it in there, chopped it all up, put it in the bin, and about 2 years later it came out looking exactly the same. So they're clearly not as compostable as we thought they were. And again, it's one of those things that's only compostable in an industrial process. And trying to collect them all up and get them into an industrial composting process was very, very difficult. So we switched to the recyclable ones. So there are mistakes along the way, and unfortunately, trial and error is a big part of your sustainable purchasing journey. One of the things we developed to try and help us make decisions between different types of products was this sort of pseudo life cycle assessment process. In an ideal world, you do a life cycle assessment on everything you buy, but in reality, nobody has that much time or that much money. And there are companies out there who will do it for you, but obviously there's quite a big expense involved. So what we did was create this sort of process of just a list of stages of the supply chain that we could think about when we were comparing different options. And this was an exercise we went through when we were deciding whether to sell soft drinks in cans or plastic bottles. And it was very much qualitative or pseudo-quantitative, in that if we could find some information on the impact on a particular stage online, then we would use that quantitative data comparatively. So rather than knowing how much carbon a can or a bottle emitted during its sort of production process, we went with, well, do we think that one is better or worse than the other one? So it was largely a comparative process. But in the end, we worked out that cans appeared to have a much lower impact across their life cycle than plastic bottles. And so we switched everything to cans, and we stopped selling plastic bottles altogether. And we stopped selling water in plastic bottles and put in all these water refilling stations so that people could bring their own bottle and charge and fill those. And it's an ongoing process. There's still more to do. There are areas, new information comes online all the time. Obviously we've got the same problems as everybody else with things like batteries and the environmental impact of the lithium and the cobalt and all that sort of stuff. And as the supply chain improves, then we can change our suppliers as more information becomes available. So it's a continuous process of re-evaluating what you buy and thinking about what is the best option as new information becomes available. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Duncan, thank you so much. That's fantastic and very candid and very practical as ever. There's a whole lot of interest going on the chat, and I'll try and summarise. A lot of people are very interested, obviously, in terms of the policy and the documents there. I think maybe there's some links that you can have on the end of the presentation that people can follow when we issue the slide packs of things that you're able to publicly disclose. Duncan? Yep,
sure. I can. The sourcing policy is on our website, so I'll dig out the link and add that on there.
Yeah, brilliant. And questions really about your supplier questionnaire, whether, I don't know if you're able to share that, or if not, give some advice on how it's done. I think there's been some chat there between the delegates about, are you using a platform? And someone's actually mentioned that, well, there's good old MS Forms where you can put in your specific questions. And if, most of us already have 365, you're going to be able to get that and analyse quite a large number of suppliers, as part of your 365, i.e. for free, so to speak. So just wondering how you're going about the digital management of your supplier data.
I have to say, ours is still very much old school, and I think it's just drawn up in Word.
Right. Okay.
So it's just it's a Word document at the moment.
Yeah.
We obviously, with a catering outlet, there's a whole load of food standards, food hygiene, safety questions that we always have to send to any food supplier. So essentially, what we did was just add to that questionnaire and add in a whole bunch of sections about environmental management and social impact on top of the questionnaire that was already been sent out by catering. And then obviously there's a disclaimer at the front that says, please ignore any questions that don't apply to you. So obviously if somebody's not selling food, they can ignore that last section about catering.
Yes.
And then when we get them back, then obviously we analyze that. And some people will say, oh no, I didn't bother answering that because it doesn't apply to us. And depending on what you're buying, you might think, well, I think it probably does apply to you, and you might have to go back and get some pushback. To date, we've only rejected one supplier.
I was going there. You don't have to name them.
No, we did. There was one company who just said, we can't fill that in. We just don't have that information.
Yes.
So I thought, well, in that case, we probably shouldn't be dealing with you. But mostly it's there either to sort of, start a conversation to say, right, if this is where you are, if you're not doing something on, one part of it, Why not? Is there anything we can do to help? Can we point you in direction for more information? That sort of stuff. So yes, I think it's only one who's actually been rejected so far.
Otherwise, some would get a must do better, sort of almost like the school reports.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain
Please
extent,
improve
because
this area.
we've been doing some sort of sustainable procurement or ethical sourcing for a while. Actually, we kind of introduced the formal process after we've been doing it for quite some time. So the majority of our suppliers are already reasonably good because we've already weeded out the bad ones, kind of thing. So yeah, we haven't got to a point where we've got any sort of there's a real problem there, we need to tackle that. It's primarily when you come to a new supplier when you want to sort of say, right, we need to buy this thing, and you think, actually we can't really, we might not be able to use you because of X. Is where the sort of questionnaire stuff becomes important.
So this is a question saying on the couple of incidents you've seen where perhaps it didn't go the way that you expected it to. Why that came about?
Well, and with the bamboo cups, obviously, bamboo's been really popular for a while. It's a great material. It grows fast. Obviously it's renewable because it grows again so quickly, and it's a very hard-wearing product. And a few years ago, everything was made by bamboo. It was clothing and all sorts of stuff. And so it seemed like a no-brainer, really. It was there were these cups. They're made from bamboo, which is this wonder material. It seemed great, but only when we started stocking them and we started digging a bit deeper, and we discovered, particularly around the compostable bit that they were claiming, it turned out again that they were compostable, but only through a fairly industrious process, and not a process that's available to the average person who might be buying one of those cups. So there's no point in selling something to the public if it needs a dedicated recycling process that isn't available.
Exactly.
On the doorstep, really. So yeah, we thought, well, we'll have to go away from those, and we'll go for something that is that we know can be recyclable. So I think the cups we sell now are metal ones that are, they're insulated. They're a nice mug.
Very good.
They're obviously a high impact in manufacture, but when you get to the end of life, it can be recycled.
Excellent. Now, unfortunately, Duncan has to leave us very shortly here, so the questions have been a little bit longer than they will be for the other presenters until we get to the Q&A. Loads there to work on. Thank you for making it so very practical there, Duncan. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to share my screen again, and I did want to pop up the feedback form, not because we're ending there at all, but because we want to hear from you what sessions that you would like us to cover going forward. So if you scan that QR code, that'll open up the feedback, and that's one of the key questions we're asking is, what do you want to hear about, and do you want to give a talk at these events? We want to hear from you. Obviously, feed in a feedback a little bit later about your experience of the whole session, but if you can have that in mind, and I think Zoe is going to just pop that link in so you're ready to do that before you leave today. So once again, thank you so much to Dr. Duncan East for an excellent presentation this morning, and we'll now move on to our next presenter, Maya McKnight from Basingstoke and Deane Borough Council. Maya, over to you, please.
Thanks, Wendy. And yeah, thanks, Duncan, for such a great presentation. Really interesting stuff, and great to hear what you're doing over at Marwell. Cool, brilliant. So yeah, firstly, hi, I'm Maya. I'm a Climate Emergency Support Officer at Basingstoke and Deane Borough Council. So I work within our climate emergency team on various different projects. But I also previously worked at Devon County Council and helped them develop their net zero supply chain work stream, and also their net zero supply chain strategy. So that's just a bit of background on me. So yeah, today just going to talk to you about a few different things. So firstly, what sustainable procurement is, what that means from a local government perspective. As we saw in the polls and stuff, most of you are very much aware of what sustainable procurement is and already implementing certain policies. Why it's important, the benefits and challenges of sustainable procurement, a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what kind of process you can go through to implement sustainable procurement in your organisation, and then finishing up with what Basingstoke and Deane and other public sector bodies are doing around the area, and then some common pitfalls that we might see from organisations who are bidding with us. So yeah, sustainable procurement, as has already really been nicely covered, considers the social, economic and environmental factors of a procurement alongside kind of the usual price and quality considerations when buying goods and services. So in essence, it should be reaching kind of every corner of your supply chain, from sourcing suppliers and workers and the likes there. There's a few different examples of things you can procure sustainably. So things such as purchasing electricity from renewable sources, changing to LED lights, low carbon construction materials, using recycled production materials that have been sourced responsibly, reducing waste by reusing packages. The local government association, who's one of the main bodies when it comes to local authorities, defines sustainable procurement as the process whereby organisations meet their needs for goods, services, works and utilities in a way that achieves value for money on a whole life basis, in terms of generating benefits not only to the organisation but also to society and the local economy, whilst minimising damage to the environment. And what they've got here is a really nice diagram that kind of breaks down the vision of local government objectives and mission. So that kind of breaks down into promoting local skills and employment, decarbonising and safeguarding our world, healthier, safer and more resilient communities, and supporting growth of responsible regional business. So those are kind of the four main categories as defined by the National TOMS framework, which is again another framework that the Local Government Association uses, and that stands for themes, outcomes and measures. What this also does is shows how kind of considering sustainable procurement can aid towards many of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. You can see those around the outside in the blue circle there. So the majority of those 17 goals are kind of areas that we hope to be able to tackle with sustainable procurement in one way, form or other. So why is it important? It's kind of already been highlighted, but why not go over it again? It's important for a multitude of reasons. Firstly, future-proofing your supply chains. Developing that sustainable procurement plan is a great way to start future-proofing your organisation against a potential shortage in supply. We've already seen kind of lots of impacts from climate change and wars on the effects on supply chains. So considering it now is a great way to kind of try and future-proof yourself, and other social factors as well that you can proof against, such as availability of technology and economic factors. Sustainability is, of course, increasingly important to stakeholders and the general public. So it's very important to reflect that in your organisation, particularly for us as a council and a public body. Sustainability is really high on the agenda for our residents. And so we really want to make sure that we're reflecting that and should be reflecting that in our council activity and procurement. So also considering the wider impact, we don't just affect what's inside of our four walls as an organisation. It's a much wider impact, and the importance of exerting your influence. So you might have seen this figure before, this diagram before. It's the greenhouse gas protocols breakdown of greenhouse gases in terms of scopes. So you've got scope 1 is your direct emissions, your scope 2, your indirect from electricity and heating and cooling, and then scope 3 from all other indirect emissions. Now, sustainable procurement doesn't just cover greenhouse gases, but this is kind of a really useful figure in terms of considering your wider impacts, because although you've got that direct impact in your scope 1, you've got a much wider impact in your scope 3, and a lot of that comes from your supply chain. So that's where considering your supply chain and sustainable procurement is really important. Particularly for us as a local authority, we've got an influence that we really want to make sure we use. So this is a figure from the Carbon Literacy Project that just demonstrates that although a minuscule 2%, again, we're using carbon emissions to demonstrate this, but about approximately 2% of UK-wide emissions come from local authorities, but about a third of those are under the influence of local authorities. This is an overall figure, so there is a few differences. Basingstoke and Deane as a borough council might have a bit less influence than Hampshire with its role in transport and infrastructure and schools. But yeah, it's just really important to consider that influence. And this is true for all organisations, not just local authorities. You've got a much wider influence than just what goes on in your building. Can you influence your customers, influencing your supply chain? So yeah, that's why that's important. The benefits, as we saw in the survey, a lot of you are already aware of the benefits. So future-proofing we've already touched on, but also risk mitigation. So if you've got a supply chain where there's bad practices, such as the use of child labour or excessive pollution, then that's really something that your customers and clients aren't going to be impressed with at the end of the day. The World Economic Forum Beyond Sustainable Procurement report says that there could be a 15 to 30% measurable brand value increase from including sustainable procurement practices. So it can really bolster your reputation as a brand. As we've said, sustainability is more and more becoming part of the conversation and is really important to stakeholders. So doing sustainable procurement is really going to show that you value that as well. Reduced costs and considerations to whole life costing. So a lot of people do think that sustainable procurement will immediately be more expensive, but when you're considering your suppliers, if they're much more efficient and are using lower energy use, then that equals lower bills, which in turn can transfer over to you as a buyer. If you're considering leasing or borrowing things as opposed to buying things, again, that's a method of reducing cost. And even in those situations where you're not reducing cost immediately, you're controlling that cost by doing sustainable procurement well. You should be considering that whole life costing, so there'll be less surprises coming through. Of course, reducing your impact on the environment is another benefit as an organisation to show through sustainable procurement. And transparency is another thing that's important to consumers. By focusing on those on procurements and considering that sustainability, it makes the process a lot more transparent, and also enables compliance with new policies that are up and coming. And we've kind of already touched on improving waste and efficiencies. There's an example from an organisation who worked with the NHS who, when they started to look at their sustainable procurement, they realised that a whole department was buying PPE equipment when it was actually free from another source. And that was, increasing waste of that PPE, but also wasting money. Of course, there's other benefits as well. At Basingstoke and Deane, we've got some electric vehicles, and we've had great feedback on our staff on how that's improved their work day by being able to use a really up to scratch EV as opposed to their old diesel vehicles. Of course, there's always going to be some challenges or hurdles to overcome, as that nice cartoon demonstrates. Of course, we spoke about the potential of decreased costs, but there might be initial upfront costs that are more expensive, and overall just more expensive over their lifetime as well. For example, electric vehicles are still more expensive when bought new compared to traditional ICE vehicles. It's also can be resource intensive. You've got the buy-in that you need from staff and stakeholders. You're going to need to potentially train up some members of staff and be able to monitor the sustainable procurement and measures and progress. Cooperation across supply chain, of course, as we mentioned, it can be quite difficult to get that collaboration, but it's really important. And is something that should be considered something to work towards as opposed to a challenge necessarily. So we've spoken about why it's important and the benefits and challenges. So I'm going to talk to you quickly about the process of sustainable procurement and how you can integrate that into your business. So yeah, we're going to start with stakeholder engagement, prioritization, early market engagement and pre-procurement, building into specification, and monitoring and contract management. So with sustainable procurement, as was kind of mentioned with the previous example, stakeholder engagement is really important. Getting that internal buy-in doesn't just work if you've just got one person driving it. It needs to be kind of a whole organization approach. You need to consider training and knowledge sharing. What do the people who are carrying out these procurements need to know, and how can they feel more confident in carrying this out and feel like it's their responsibility and something that they want to do as well. External engagement is also important. As a local authority, we've got to consider what our residents want and what sustainability means to them, as well as to us as an organisation. And consider your relevant organisation targets and values. So what can sustainable procurement help you achieve? So for example, we've got a net zero target of 2025. So what can we use to sustainable procurement to help with this? So prioritization is really important. As we've spoken, it can be quite a resource intensive process. So before you get started with all of this, you can consider where your efforts are best spent. So what can you consider in that? Consider where your spend is, the environmental impacts and the social risks. So this figure here just shows, is it taken from Oxygen Finance Insights tool, which is a public sector tool that can help organisations look at their spend and the associated carbon impacts of that. So yeah, can you look at what your highest spends are with and what the environmental impacts is like? So for example, if your highest spend is with a cloud-based server, you can integrate sustainable procurement on this. But if your second biggest spend is for construction, for example, it might be odd if it was that way around, but then maybe your best efforts are put into that construction contract, because that's where you can have the biggest impact. So yeah, it's important to just consider that in terms of what contracts to look at first, and yeah, where the most effort can and hotspots are, and where you'll see the biggest bang for your buck essentially. So once you've decided where you're prioritising, pre-procurement and commissioning stage is really important. As Duncan really nicely spoke about, it's really important to firstly consider the need. Buying new should be the last thing on your list. So really think about if there's other methods that you can use. And then once you've determined that you do actually need to purchase something, then you can start to think about what solutions you can put in place. That's where early market engagement can really come into fruition. You might think you know a lot about what you're buying, but the people that you're buying it from are probably going to be the experts in that field. So can you talk to them about what existing technologies there are and what solutions are available? It will also help you determine market maturity and capability. So where is the market in terms of these solutions? And it can help you test what you want to put into specification as well. So the specification, particularly in local government, is the kind of the last stage that you can really integrate that sustainability before things are set in stone for the tender. So you want to make sure you're determining relevant specification, and particularly for us as a council, we want to make sure that's relevant and proportionate. We want to be making sure that we're, not discouraging any SMEs from applying. So if we're asking people to be net zero when they when we go out for procurements, it might not be relevant and proportionate or realistic for those people. And also at this stage, you can consider how you're evaluating the specification. There's no point just whacking a few different standards in and not knowing how to evaluate those and therefore integrate that into your future contracts. So there's a few different examples of requirements here. You need to just make sure that the certifications are relevant to what you're purchasing. So there's a few different examples of eco labels for technology products. Of course, we've all heard of fair trade. Can you just consider recycled materials or refurbished products? So, as we spoke about, buying, the most sustainable procurement is the one that doesn't happen. But if it does have to happen, can you look at buying secondhand or refurbished? Of course, there's you can look for targets and plans for carbon reduction. Zoe, I think, mentioned the standards earlier, the PAS 2060, as well as the new ISO one that's coming out. The central government also have a procurement policy notice that requires all contracts with central government to have a carbon reduction plan. This is something that we can ask, other companies can ask to see from people that they're supplying from. Of course, wood and paper products and social responsibility. And there's other examples you might look for, such as the modern slavery statements, are people purchasing electricity from renewable sources, and similar things there. So once you've got your supplier and you've got your contract sorted, then you need to make sure you're monitoring that and really doing efficient contract management. So there's no point going through that whole process if then once you've got the contract or goods or service, you're not going to follow through with that. So you need to be setting clear and achievable targets and KPIs. So yeah, as we've spoken about before, collaboration is really important in those early stages. But once that contract is signed, collaboration doesn't stop there. It needs to keep going. Regularly reviewing the contract and data, and also considering what data can be used and methods of analysing. There's no point asking for data if you're not going to use it or consider it. It makes just extra work for your supplier and for you. So these are kind of examples of where you've got an ongoing contract, but also for one-off procurements, it's important to think about how those are going to be used. If you've worked really hard to get some smart energy controls and insulation for your office building, and all your staff are overriding those controls and just whacking the heating up, but then leaving the windows wide open, it's integrating that learning into making sure that procurement is worthwhile. So what are we doing at Basingstoke and Deane specifically? We've got a minimum 5% weighting for social value, so that's considering the social, economic and environmental impacts of all of our procurements. This is a minimum weighting, so of course it can be higher depending on the procurement. We encourage all of our staff to consider sustainability for all of their procurements. We have an internal intranet page that discusses sustainable procurement, and we rolled out some informal training when we launched those, as well as having our internal climate change training as well. We also work with our 2 biggest suppliers, so this gross location based emissions shows that our biggest emissions come from our leisure centre gas and our waste fleet. So those are our contracts with those 2 suppliers, and those 2 contracts account for over 50% of our spend. So by working with them, we're working with a large chunk of our supply chain. And by working with our waste fleet, we've been working on sustainable solutions together. Soon we're going to be transitioning our waste fleet to be using an alternative low carbon fuel, HVO, which could reduce those carbon emissions from that contracts by up to 90%. And that's come through working together. But HVO is another really good example of considering sustainable procurement as a whole, although it has lower carbon footprint if you consider it just from that aspect. You might be using virgin materials that's leading to land use change or land loss. So it's really important to consider that whole sustainable procurement and the biodiversity as well, making sure you're not using virgin materials. We're supporting local businesses. We've got a climate essentials trial that's got that's onboarded. We're currently on board 9 businesses to help them consider their environmental impact. There is 1 space left on that, so if anyone in Basingstoke and Deane Borough is interested in joining up to that climate essentials trial, then do send the climate change team an email, and we'll send you a link to apply. Our new green team, who as well as supporting residents are also going to be looking to support businesses with their sustainability journeys, have recently been launched, so they'll be helping out businesses in the borough. We have a business toolkit on our website, and we've also got a Love Basingstoke brand which promotes what's going on in the borough, and they've set up a borough basket which promotes local businesses in the borough. There's a few other case studies of public sector bodies that are doing some really good work in this area. So Suffolk County Council ask all of their suppliers to sign up to their climate change commercial ask. So this basically encourages their suppliers all to know the impact of their organisation, to ensure that they're measuring their impact and reporting on it, and showing that they're working to reduce those negative environmental impacts and on the environment. Preston City Council have done some pioneering work called the Preston Model, working with other key anchor institutes in the Lancashire area to look at trying to invest in the local area and grow those local benefits. So that's really looking kind of at the social side of sustainable procurement. And finally, the NHS use an evergreen sustainable supplier assessment, which they ask all of their suppliers to fill out before procuring with them. And sorry, I have gone a little bit over, but just some last common pitfalls when bidding that we see as the council. So lack of evidence. If you're bidding for something and you're just putting in unsupported claims, then that's not gonna be very well received by the person that is buying. Putting in unrealistic or unsupported targets. It might be great to see that you've got a net zero target for next week, but if you're not backing that up with a kind of a carbon reduction plan or anything like that, then it's not necessarily going to be well received, and not considering the specification of the tender. So it's really important to kind of apply your practices to the tender that you're looking at. So you'll get more points awarded if you've shown that you've considered how your organisation has thought about and prepared a response to that specific tender, as opposed to kind of a generic catch-all tender. You can kind of try and prep in advance, if you've got policies yourself, climate policies, waste reduction plans, then you can have those ready to go when you're looking to procure with the council. So that's everything from me. There's some useful resources on this last slide that I think will be made available at the end. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Maya. There's so much there, actually. I have a feeling we've got the perfect segue as well into the Q&A session. Just to make a little observation there, with the net zero, this comes up almost every event that we do here. The ISO guideline is a non-branded and independent definition of net zero and how to do it. I think, and just a shout out there to Zoe Booth, who presented earlier, you might have the link in what you had there to the ISO guideline, because I think that's really important, because then you've got options. You don't have to necessarily go down the science-based targets or anyone else's branded definition of it. ISO have one in their guidelines. So just to make a little just a plug for the ISO, because anyone can use it and you can download it, I think, for free as well. You did actually answer one of the questions there that we had on email, just anonymously. I had someone asking, have you seen any real howlers whilst you've been doing sustainable procurement? And really, what was the howler that you saw from anyone on that, really, Maya, without mentioning any names? What's the worst you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't think you ever see particular howlers. I think it's just not backing up your claims is kind of one of the key things I'd say. It's really good being able to have all these ambitions and stuff, and it's still worth putting in if you've got aims. But if you're kind of not telling the person who's procuring how you're going to get to those aims, then it's can be a bit of a null point. So yeah, I think those are probably that's probably one of the key areas.
I think that probably is the perfect segue. Chris, I know you have a question there. I've got a couple of extra submitted ones on email that are very similar, so I want to broaden that out, if I may now, and bring back Zoe Booth. Zoe, if you can pop your video back on, please, and unmute, that would be fantastic. Here we go. Great. Okay. Well, I'm going to try and paraphrase what's been basically 3 different questions set in, which really are about assessing where and I think it really is, the carbon emissions are the biggest source of the carbon emissions, how you do that at a top level, and then if you're going to do that deeper dive down on the higher contributors. I guess we'll start off with how do you get a sense of what's important in that supply chain? When you look, some of us are sitting here, got 100+ suppliers. How do I know which ones are the big ones? Okay, Maya, I think I'm going to look to you, because I know you showed a model of that. If you want to just add a bit more onto that. So how do we get that top level view of what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think spend is a really good place to begin with that. It's quite often quoted that your top 20% of suppliers are going to account for 80% of your spend. So if you can look at those suppliers or contracts that you're spending the most money with, one that's going to be appealing to the supplier to have those conversations with you if you're spending a lot of money with them, but also as an organisation, that spend is kind of, that's a really vital contract to you. So that's kind of a priority area. But also being able to break it down into kind of what that spend is on. So as for us as a local authority, we've got our waste and recycling contract, which is a really big contract, because it's got fuel use. It might require purchasing of new refuse vehicles, but some of our other biggest contracts are kind of more online based services. So in terms of our time and effort, although spend might be similar. It's not in this example, but if it was, you'd want to concentrate those efforts onto that kind of more physical almost supply chain, I'd say, because although you might have an impact on the more online based, they're probably not going to see as bigger impact.
Thank you, Maya. Zoe, any more to add to that? And from your perspective.
Yeah, I think Maya kind of covered a lot of it there. Looking at spend is a really great place to start. And there are, obviously this is focusing a little bit more on the carbon side of it, but there are kind of spend-based calculations that you can do to get a rough kind of carbon figure there. So if that's your kind of main point of interest, focusing on the net zero side of things, then that's a really good way to go. And you can identify those hotspots and look at which suppliers you need to be working with. I know these factors are kind of based on industrial classification codes. So if you can build that into your systems, the earlier you can do that, then you can actually kind of calculate that a little bit more easily and with a little bit more sight into what those things are and where to start looking first.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I think that we did have a Sustainable Business Network session looking at supply carbon footprint. I think, Zoe, it might be worth just popping the white paper that we had on that. So in that document, you'll see the formula that you need to use. So you can pop that into MS Excel. It's all down on the page there. You don't need to buy an expensive software or anything. Just type those formulae into Excel and you're away. So that's all good. There's lots and lots down on here, so I'm just going to scan through. Can we have some examples of procurement questionnaires that are good so we can know what it looks like? Ask Samantha. Over to Maya. I don't know if it would be Basingstoke and Deane that would have one, if that would be appropriate, or things that you favour or like the look of online. I guess if we all Googled right now or put into ChatGPT, that would tell us what it likes, and we can make of that what we will. Maya, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we don't have one ourselves that we can share, but there are some really good examples of best practice out there. I think I'd have to go away and check what if there's kind of templates that can be used. I think Suffolk County Council's climate change commercial ask it's not necessarily a questionnaire to ask staff, our suppliers, but it's a nice thing to get suppliers to sign up to, and it also kind of is a good way of not of being proportionate and realistic. You're not putting people off by asking really intensive questions, but just asking them to align with your values and your targets. I think in my previous role at Devon County Council, we did some Microsoft Forms surveys with suppliers to find out about their stance. But yeah, I'd have to take it away and look see if there's any templates out there.
Great. So I think a little bit of Googling to do actually there, which I think we can all have a go at. Some good questions there are saying, how do you record, Maya, when you have second-hand equipment? How it would be useful to know how Duncan's doing this as well. But yeah, how does the council go about just, recording whether things are bought new or refurbed to evidence how you're getting on with that?
I think unfortunately that would be a question for one of my procurement colleagues. Yep. I think in terms of that's where one of the issues with kind of just looking at carbon footprint in its own right can be an issue. So yeah, like Zoe mentioned, using spend conversion factors, it doesn't account for secondhand. So that's where kind of the prioritization comes in terms of collecting data as well. So yeah, if you're using your top contracts, you can start getting that conversation with people and start looking more in depth at that. But yeah, I think I'd have to double check with our procurement
I'm
colleagues how they record that.
going to come back to the point about with the supply chain. I'm going to say sustainability rather than just carbon at the moment, and that deep dive element of, okay, you've discovered what the top few are. How far in do you get, and do you engage specialists in assessing those top few suppliers that may be contributing mostly to the emissions or to the sustainability of your business? How do you take that next step of that deep dive?
We're still quite early on in our journey, I'd say. We're quite lucky in the sense that our top 2 contracts that account for over 50% of our spend it's been a very close partnership with them since that contract began. In terms of a deep dive, we've used the Oxygen Finance Insights tool, which is a free platform for public sector bodies that kind of looks into your supply chain. It is based on carbon, unfortunately, but it does use spend to look at that carbon. But yeah, I think we haven't yet used consultants. This is just something that we're starting to look at internally, and we've got those connections with those 2 biggest contracts already.
Okay. And Zoe, I think you've been involved in this where you go to the next level, so beyond the spend data and getting as close as we can to those actuals from the supplier.
Yeah.
How long and how hard is it to do?
I mean, it really is one of those things, kind of how long is a piece of string sometimes. The first step really is to ask the question to those key suppliers, because in some cases you'll find that they already do have this information available. So it can be as quick as a couple of weeks just getting it and just asking the right people. And once you've got that, obviously you can start kind of implementing that into your own kind of calculations, whether it's carbon or biodiversity or other areas straight away. In cases where they don't have that information available, it might take a little bit longer. It could be months, it could be, a couple of years, depending on what it is. But if you've got kind of direct links to manufacturers, for example, you might get that process a little bit faster. And obviously, as more people go up the chain, we should find that in the next decade or so, this information is much more readily available. But it is really about kicking off that process and getting things moving.
I've had emails sent directly, want to remain anonymous here, that some of those big suppliers just don't yield the data, don't give us what we want. We're used to asking for things on MSDS's material safety data sheets, but we can't get the carbon from them. Should we ditch them? What do we think to that, or how do we put that pressure on, some of those bigger suppliers to come up with the goods? I guess this is really talking about, product carbon footprints, life cycles, that type of thing, and the availability of that information. I know so many of us these days need to disclose our company carbon footprints because we're required to by law, but not of the products. So I think that's the essence of that email there is it can be difficult sometimes to get, even though this particular person's in a big organisation, is still struggling a bit with the supplier to give them the data that they want. Yes, you're smiling. You've seen that before.
Yeah. I have more than once. So obviously there is an element of looking at alternative suppliers. It's great if you already have a kind of good setup with your supplier. It's fantastic if you can work with them and collaborate and make those changes. A lot of suppliers are more open to this now than, possibly 5 years ago or so. However, if it's something you're really struggling with and it's a big sticking point for your organisation, it is worth looking at alternative suppliers and what is on offer there. There's no harm in doing that anyway. It's kind of good practice to review your suppliers anyway. However, I would kind of urge to, as important as the carbon side is, as we've touched on today, look at some of those other areas of sustainability. obviously we're looking possibly at manufacturing on that side, but there may be cases where you have small suppliers, and the reason that they can't provide that for you is because they're a small business. The reality is that some of those businesses probably won't be contributing too much carbon. Obviously, great to work with them longer term to get those numbers, but if they're doing some really other good stuff around biodiversity, kind of social sides of things, then don't necessarily kind of rule them out just on that basis.
Good stuff. Good stuff. I think it's questions and themes about 14,001 and how this helps with a certification. I think that's the adaptation of 14,001. How useful is everything that we're talking about today alongside 14,001? Zoe, I think you're probably best placed to answer this one. I know that you manage that in your business.
Yeah, so the 14,001 does require you to be looking at your suppliers and kind of the environmental impacts of your business. So it is important in that sense. I think someone mentioned in the chat there that things like having ISO 14,001 is a good way to actually demonstrate to who you're supplying to that you are kind of doing the things that you need to be doing. Obviously, it captures kind of a certain kind of elements of the sustainability, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try and go beyond those things, but they really are a good starting point, and it shows that it is kind of integral within the operations of your business, because you tends to be kind of process based about how you kind of run the actual business day to day.
Great. Okay, I'm just trying to keep up to speed with so many comments there on the chat. How are we doing for timing? I think we've got just a little bit of time remaining there. Just looking through some of those other comments that we have, and the online. Great. Yeah, still there on the risk. Setting up a risk matrix for this. I know, Maya, you showed some earlier. Are there any, I guess, free resources online that you might direct people to, or things that you can share in terms of scoring for sustainable procurement?
We've just got an internal Excel spreadsheet matrix essentially that we use to help with our weighting. So we'll basically just assign a percentage weighting to a certain part of the evaluation,
right.
And then we'll score those, and the Excel spreadsheet basically works out based on the percentages.
Okay. And I think you showed earlier what some of those categories are. So you break it down into those categories. I guess in terms of those weightings, that will depend on your organisation and your priorities. Any comment on that?
Yeah, I think with local government, obviously, we're it's public money that we're spending. So until earlier this year, it was kind of always the most economically advantageous tender. So there was a bit more restriction in terms of how much sustainability you could put into your procurements. And it was very much more focused on the cost. So you've got the cost in there, and then depending on the organization, you can put certain percentages. Like I said, we've got a minimum of 5% for social value. Some organizations go up to 10% minimum, up to 40%. So yeah, it really does depend on the organization and where your priorities are. But also setting a minimum isn't setting a maximum. So you might have that organizational minimum, but depending on the procurement, you can modify that internally as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and thanks to the audience for lots of questions and comments and all things. There are a few things we need to do just now, and first of all, Zoe is going to put the feedback form back on screen for us all there, and I'm going to share my screen, and there we go, that's the poll results, and do a mindless plug for the a shameless plug I'm going to do a shameless plug for you, please, to visit the online library. This session will go up there hopefully before the weekend is out. That QR code is how you can access the whole of the sessions. Lots of different things in there. Some of the subjects obviously we touched on today, supply chain, the carbon footprinting there, that certainly that element is there. There's a whole session on net zero, whole session on biodiversity, lots of great stuff. So please do dip into that. I must now flash up that QR code as the feedback form. Please do let us know what you thought of today's session. We'd love to hear from you with topics you'd like us to cover. And if you'd like to present at one of these events, let us know, please. These sessions only take place because of the sponsorship of the 3 councils, being Rushmore, Hart and Basingstoke and Deane. So thank you so much to them for continuing to support these sessions. Just to end and with a great big thanks to all of our presenters today. I will do one final plug because Duncan East will kill me if I don't. We've got a session for the new year. I think it's going to be about the 2nd or 3rd week of January. We're going to be targeting greenwashing and green hushing, which is the other thing we have to avoid, green hushing. We're going to be talking about that in a session that's going to be online about week 3 in January. We'll be sending you an invite over to that, and hopefully you'll be able to make that. Only remains for me to say thank you for joining us today. I hope you've gone away with some good and practical ideas on sustainable procurement, and we look forward very much to seeing you at the next Sustainable Business Network event. Thank you.